Perfect. So originally we thought about taking a tour to go look at the testing rooms, but by design, they are the most boring place in the world. We figured that we would do a little recreation here and not make you walk all the way to our campus to get in the room with a table. And then, importantly, we'll talk about kind of a little demo of the kind of cognitive testing that we do kind of with the ADRC protocol. And then I'll have some slides that will go over, okay, now that we have this data, how do we interpret it? What does it mean? And how does it inform our, diagnostic work of dementia and etiology? And then I'm going to leave some time at the end where I'm hoping we can engage in a discussion and answer questions and talk about cognitive testing in the context of large scale studies or in kind of like social behavioral research. So I want to introduce you to some key folks in our clinical core of the ADRC. We have Marissa and we have Zach. And so they help lead some of our patient business and kind of oversee the cognitive testing when we have a participant come in for the ADRC evaluation. And so we are going to do just a little mock kind of testing session. We shortened it for your enjoyment when we have participants come in. These exams usually last, like 2 hours or so, maybe even a little longer. And so that's quite a lot. And we specifically tried to pick a couple of the tests that may be a bit more representative of what actual neuropsychological evaluation may look like. I know that in the context of survey research, cognitive evaluation is generally part of that sort of data collection process. And so, a lot of those tests have to be something that you can administer over the phone that are pretty, easy to administer. And so I'm going to just give a brief demonstration, or Zach and Marissa will, of maybe some more neuropsychological oriented tests and what that can tell us about the brain as well. So with that, I'm going to try to put my microphone here so we can all hear them. All right, and we're going to go ahead and start our cognitive testing demo. Can you try to talk and see?
I think so. Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
A little bit? Okay, great. So there's also a shield in front of me, so if there are any gong sounds, it's just fumbling around. Hi Marissa, thanks for coming in today. So we're going to be doing some cognitive testing, and just as a reminder, try and do the best you can. These tests are meant to be difficult, and if it's a perfect score on these tests, so you can expect them to be challenging. Most of what we'll be doing is kind of verbal back and forth. Some of it will be on paper and pens. I'll give you some explanation a little later on. Did you have any questions before we get started?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, great. Well, I'm going to start by reading you a story, and I would like you to listen carefully. When I'm through, I want you to tell me everything that you can remember. Try to use the same words I use, but you can also use your own words.
Okay.
Are you ready?
Yes.
Okay, here comes the story. Maria's child, Ricky, played soccer every Monday at 3:30. He liked going to the field behind their house and joining the game. One day, he kicked the ball so hard that it went over the neighbor's fence where 3 large dogs lived. The dog's owner heard loud barking, came out and helped them retrieve the ball. Okay, now try and tell me as much as you can from that story, please.
Oh. There was a lady whose son, Ricky, liked to play ball behind the house in the afternoon. One day, he kicked the ball over the neighbor's fence, and there were some dogs there. The neighbor saw the ball and gave it back to him.
Anything else?
No.
Great. Try to remember that story. I'll ask you to tell it to me again in a little while. All right, next, I'm going to show you this page, and you can see there are some numbers and letters on this page. So I didn't bring a pen.
I don't have a pen.
Oh, you got one. Usually in my bag. Okay, yeah, so there are some numbers and letters and circles on this page. I'd like you to try and connect these numbers in ascending alternating order, alternating from number to letter, number to letter. So you go from 1 to A to 2, and so on. You'll start here and end here. Try to keep your pen on the page. Okay, actually, if I can have you come back to here and go to the next. Thank you.
Oh, okay, I see, number, letter.
So on this page are some more numbers and letters, and again, I want you to connect them alternating from number to letter, number to letter. Starting here at 1, ending here. Again, try to keep your pen on the page, and work as quickly as you can.
Okay,
Ready?
I'm ready.
Begin. Let's see if I can have you come back here and start back here and go to the next one. If I can have you come back to this one and go. And have you come back to this one and go. Yep. Right, next I'm going to show you an object. I would just like you to copy this object as accurately as you can. So if I can have you copy that object down below accurately. Okay, and then you can be sure to remember it. I'm going to ask you to draw it again later from memory. Next, I'm going to show you some pictures. I would just like you to try and tell me the name of each one of these pictures, please.
That's a moth.
Can you think of another name?
Butterfly. Glove. Light bulb. Watch. Firecracker.
Another name for that one?
It's used to explode things.
Starts with a K sound.
Light. Candle. Candle. Clown. Kite. I know it's the colors. Rainbow. Witch. I don't know what that is.
It's a, I can't remember the prompt, children's something.
Found on a post.
Oh. A seesaw. Flashlight. Ostrich.
Think of another name for that one?
What is it? I can't.
Starts with a P sound.
Not penguin. Peacock. Snail. Mannequin.
Goes on a person's head.
Wig. Screw. Scarf. I know it's used to pick up things.
Starts with a D sound.
I don't know. Blinds. Is that a weight?
It's used for measuring air pressure.
Gauge.
Yeah.
Gauge. Oh.
It's used for shaping metal. And it starts with that A sound.
Ing. Anvil.
Thank you. And
I know you used to grind, but I don't know what it's called.
there's two things here. Starts with the M and a P. Sorry, so M and a P sound.
Mallet and pedestal. Axle.
Oh. Wants to go back to just. Okay. All right, a little while ago, I read you a short story, and I would just like you to try and recall as much as you can from that story now, please.
Oh. There was a kid who played outside at some time. I think it was 3 p.m. And he had a soccer ball and it got kicked into a yard. And there was a man who helped him get it back.
Anything else?
I think there were barkings.
Great, thank you.
All right, well, thank you so much for the. So that was excellent. So that was just a little taste of some of the tasks that we ask participants to do in the ADRC. And some of them are based on classic neuropsychological, well, they all are based on classical neuropsych evaluations. One thing to note about the UDS battery is that a lot of the clinical sort of analogous tests are proprietary. So they're basically created by these publishing companies and you have to pay them money for the response booklets and for access to the tested manual. And that's because in a clinical setting, we're generating profit, so they want some too. But as far as research goes, you know, when it comes, you know, for a long time, you're really relying on these, you know, proprietary tests to be able to measure cognition. So one of the beautiful things about the NAC and the uniform data set is that it basically took these standard neuropsychological tests that we've been giving for decades and basically created free open source versions of them. So they're getting at the same principles that we would do in a clinical setting. However, they were developed for research purposes, and they've had a particular emphasis, at least on some of these tests, to account for more cultural differences and things like that. I would say one of the probably key differences in a face-to-face neuropsychological evaluation is, you know, as we tried to demonstrate, there are moments where we're intervening. You know, she was making some errors on that test where, you know, 1A, 2B, where she had to alternate letters and numbers. And you have to physically reach over, cross out the line, that's not correct, please start again here. And so that's something that oftentimes, it's hard to do when you're, doing a survey over the phone or assessing cognition. It does require a lot of training on the part of the examiner to kind of know when to step in, how to deal with errors, and how to, kind of administer that test correctly. Some of the other things that we do in these neuropsych tests is not only we're interested in errors, we're interested in the kind of errors people are making and what that actually means. When she was trying to come up with names of objects, there were times where she couldn't think of the name. Actually, there's sometimes when she was misperceiving the object. Didn't see it clearly for what the design was, which is when we give one type of cue, which is giving the definition, like, oh, it's not a man, it's not a glove, and it's not a map, it's actually a picture of a glove. So that's like a totally different part of the process of the brain that kind of perceives that picture. And then there are times where she just couldn't come up with the word itself. And that's actually what that test is looking for. Those semantic cues where we're at, telling them the meaning of the object, trying to reorient them to exactly what word we're looking for. If they can still correct their response after that, that's okay. What we care more about is when they can recognize the object, but can't come up with that word, so that word finding problem. And so when we do administer these tests, it does require, it's not just the final score that matters, it's the process sometimes that matters, how they get to that. The test where she was drawing, copying the figure, not only are we looking at, can she exactly, precisely copy it like the design, but what's her approach to it? Does she have a disorganized approach? Are there visual spatial distortions in that test that kind of says maybe she's having problems with her parietal lobe versus a very disorganized figure where you do it piecemeal would be more frontal lobe. She doesn't have that appropriate planning to kind of draw the scaffolding of the box first and then fill in the designs after. And so that kind of is how, clinical neuropsychology works. We care about the scores, we care about the process, and we also care about kind of how each test tells us something different about the brain. So that's what we're going to transition now. Yeah, questions?
So on those imaging tests, like when he showed the air pressure gauge, which I recognize because I go scuba diving,
right.
But I was like, what percentage of the population actually would use that kind of like, so you're saying it's not that they know what the item is, but that if they do know what it is, that they know the name of it. Or because there were some things too that I was looking at, like what a dustpan, right? Like if a man never cleans the house, is he gonna know what a dustpan is, right? Or like the anvil. I mean, do women? Yeah, like I like some of those are very like specific to the types of tasks that you do around the house or the types of hobbies that you engage in. And so like how much of this diagnostic is actually picking up on the things that people are familiar with versus the things they've never come in contact with.
And that's a very good point. One thing when designing these tests is this, believe it or not, this test in particular is called the multilingual naming test, which was developed to be more applicable. Believe it or not, the clinical test is even more biased, right? So this test was actually developed to be more kind of neutral as far as kind of culture and background. What you're saying kind of falls into kind of what we'll talk about in a second, which is like, what does that score actually mean, right? So as you saw, some of the items got pretty hard at the end. Yeah. A good neuropsych test is not going to have that ceiling effect. We don't want everybody to get everything right. If everybody ceilinged out on that test and everything was an object that they would recognize and know, it's not telling us anything at all. So even though she may have missed some items, that doesn't mean that she was impaired on that test. So we're going to compare her score to what we consider to be her peers, and that's through this normative process. And I'll talk about that in the slides. Yeah.
Can I ask a question about it's like immediate and delayed story recollection? So like Zach, if you're administering this, what are you writing down? I mean, you said something about trying to use the same words. From like a survey perspective, I'm thinking about the value of recording these, but like you're also as the administrator, like you are prompting, you're correcting, you're also writing stuff down. I mean, what do you write? What are you looking for? What are you scoring?
Really good point. The multitasking piece can be a huge obstacle for any of us that are learning. So as we're training, we're trying to pay attention to that for our coordinators. But typically we're recording in our case, and then also trying to write down as much as we can get.
Yeah. So the transcript is critical for these sort of like storytelling tests, because this test is actually scored in two different ways. We have a verbatim score that comes out of it. So of the exact words that were said in that story, how many of them could they recall correctly? So, and then we also have what we call a paraphrase score. Did they get the gist of it? So, if they didn't say exactly something, so this is verbatim. It takes every word in that story to get a point or not. And then you have this paraphrase score that basically gets at the general idea. So you don't necessarily have to say Maria. If you said Mary, that's close enough. You get the gist, right? Or if you said something like, you know, what's another good paraphrase one? Like
owner versus neighbor.
Oh, if you say like, yeah, then the owner came out instead of saying exactly the neighbor came out, you know, the owner of the dog. So you get a point for that. So we actually have 2 different scores that result from that test, and the transcript is needed to be able to do that scoring exactly. So he was typing exactly what she was saying as she was going. We also record it, so if it gets missed, we can go back and listen to the recording to get that exact transcript. But those words are meaningful as far as the score goes, and it, you know, the scoring criteria, it doesn't even have to be in the exact order. As long as they said one of the words in verbatim, you know, verbatim, it doesn't matter how it appeared in the story, the context, as long as the word was said, it gets a point. So that's why you really need the whole story to be able to look at, well, they said he later on, even though there's a he credit, you know, at the very beginning of the story.
I have a question.
Yeah.
You go on. Whenever you heard questions, for example, happened with me right now. I'm from Brazil. Some of the picture they have he show, I don't know the name in English.
Yeah.
If you interview a Hispanic or Chinese,
Yeah.
do you have some translation?
Yes.
If I respond in Portuguese or Spanish,
Yeah.
is that the name of
Yeah.
the what you show?
Yeah.
How you counting on this, or you flagging it first? Oh, she know better because he's elderly. She
Yeah.
probably get
So-
education in Mexico or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So,
In a research context, we have to think about the validity of testing. If we're giving somebody a test in a language that's not their first language, then, you know, we're not unsure whether the score they're getting actually reflects their cognitive status, right? This test in particular has been translated into several languages. I don't know if Portuguese is one of them, but it has been. And some other tests like that we have, there's a lot of Spanish translation, the whole battery. Other languages, I think they're working on a Cantonese version as well for the NAC battery as well. But in a clinical context, what you're getting at is like, you know, sometimes I'll see a patient in clinic, and even though, you know, English isn't their first language, but they're fluent in English and they've, you know, lived here for 40 years. Well, when I'm doing that test, I actually will let them tell me, and I'll write it down. I'll write down, you know, what they said in their alternate or their first language, and then I'll go at the end and look it up and see if they got it right. Because what I'm really interested in is that process between like being able to see a picture of an item and link it with the name. And it doesn't matter what language it's necessarily in. We're not looking at how bilingual you are. It's more just like, can you recognize an object and pull up the name that, you know, given the meaning of it. So in a clinical context, I would be creative kind of with that response. But in a research context, you know, that's why, you know, we require a certain degree of proficiency and things like that, and, you know, just try to keep it as standardized as possible. But yes, a lot of these tests have been translated to other languages, but there are limitations when you're assessing people who are bilingual, because in a research context, we don't have that flexibility because we're really trying to come up with a very standardized way of doing this.
Lots of response. Oh, I was gonna ask, to what extent do you take time into account? Like, does it matter if people think about stuff quickly or if they come to it? And then sort of self-correction, right? People,
Yes.
like, there are times where like you'd say something wrong, but then if you figure it out.
Yeah, that's a great question. Some of the tests are timed by nature. And we'll kind of look at this when we go across the cognitive profile. I mean, there are many reasons why you can do poorly on a time test. And so one is that you're having trouble with that actual skill we're asking you to do. And the other is she's got slow processing across the board, and every time test you're going to be slow at. So there are things where time is an outcome, and we look at that. There are other times where, you know, that's kind of the beauty too of like digital testing at times, is that like you're capturing reaction times on everything. And that's actually just another data point, even if it's not primary. In regards to kind of like the other thing with time, so some of these items do have time limits to produce a response, and that's just to keep the test going. It's not necessarily to punish people. They're usually a reasonable amount of time. It's just we can't take 4 hours to do this sort of thing. And if you're having that much difficulty, it probably means something anyway. But yeah, so time is a factor. Of the tests we just did, the only timed one was actually the connecting numbers, letters. Yeah.
Do you guys have, so like in this mock session, you started with the story, which like I was sitting there going, Jesus, that's like that's a hard test to like start with. Do you guys think about like how it Like how does it happen actually in clinic? Like, do you kind of ease them into it so that it's not reflecting like stress and anxiety? And you know, like, I'm just curious.
I'm so excited about the questions. It's questions. The order of tests matters tremendously. We start with a little spiel. I think we might have abbreviated a little bit just for the sake of this, but it's really important to let them know that just because a test seems hard at times, it doesn't necessarily mean you're doing poorly, that these tests are designed to push your limits. Not everyone gets everything right. So we try to put them at ease at the beginning. And then, yes, we generally do kind of warm up with some, like the MoCA maybe.
First.
So that's just kind of a global kind of screening measure that most people who have normal cognition would do just fine on. We're asking them to remember 5 words, not the 15 that we do later.
Our whole school.
Exactly. And so yeah, and the other thing to keep in mind with the order of administration is that, we just saw 2 tests that we asked them to remember stuff from earlier. So there's a delay period, and you have to be really mindful of the other types of tests you put in that delay period. You don't want to put a test in the delay that would interfere with their ability to remember something from earlier on, right? So if you're doing kind of if you're doing learning a word list, right? So random 15 words, and then later on you want to ask them about those words 15 minutes later. You don't put that naming test in the middle because you're basically showing them a bunch of objects and they're saying a bunch of words repeatedly, right? So you want to fill that space with more visual spatial tasks, more processing speed, basically something that's not tapping into that verbal memory, like, language part. So all of these things are like, all require careful consideration when you're designing a cognitive battery, like the order of the tests, like what fillers you're using in your delay periods. And so that's where kind of collaborating with the neuropsychologist can be really helpful. That's kind of our bread and butter. That's what we do. So, and we know kind of what configurations will lead to more valid data versus not.
No, go ahead.
Okay.
Well, I was just thinking about participant frustration.
Uh-huh.
So especially, you kept having to redirect in the numbers and letters tab.
Oh yeah, we make people mad.
For the first 2 hours,
Yeah.
how much are things like
Yes.
openness, agreeability, and like personality factors biasing some of these tests toward one
I love social
more
skills.
agreeable? Yeah.
No, I mean, you're totally right. These tests are frustrating for people. We try to take breaks. We try to explain ahead of time, like that these are going to frustrate you a little bit. We try to just normalize it all. During testing, we don't want to provide any feedback that's necessarily commenting on their performance level.
Mhm.
Like, that was right. But you can give the general encouragement of like, doing just fine. Everyone finds this really hard. Just kind of validating sort of their concerns and anxiety. I've even had patients where I've done deep breathing in the middle of testing. Like, just whatever it takes to kind of try to and we want their optimal performance. So that does matter when they're anxious and things like that. Sometimes we can't do anything about that. And so what we do is we have a behavioral observation sheet. So we actually can make notes of like, during this test, this patient seemed really, really anxious and I don't think it was their best. So that when I get the results at the end of the day, I might have not been the one testing them, but I have clear documentation about what has been questionably valid and why. So the person was overly anxious. And so that might not be a really adequate measure of their true cognitive ability, right? So it's all taken into account. And so when I'm looking like at the results, I might place a little less emphasis on that test and that particular score, or at least understand that like maybe they were nervous or something like that. So you can't control for everything, but you can try your best to take it into account. So that's kind of, yeah.
How do you think about the ability to attend?
Like attention?
Attention. So I'm just thinking like ADHD is such a diagnosis, including adult.
Mhm.
Right, like obviously it affects your short-term memory and thus your ability to like recall something later. I'm curious if that's like coming up at this point, even from how people think about doing assessments or.
Yeah, so attention's hard, and we'll talk about this in just a second, but it really is the
It
is the building block of all other cognitive abilities.
Yeah.
You can't attend to anything in your environment, you have no chance of understanding it, learning it, remembering it, anything else. And that's where kind of the pattern interpretation comes in. Like you can look at certain tests and you can say like, okay, their attention was, they were unable to pay attention. And then, based on that, like that might have affected their learning on the word list, for example. And so it's just kind of, it's all these, you know, as a neuropsychologist, when I'm looking at these tests, there's like a million things, like connections being made in my brain about how these tests relate to one another and like what you can tell by looking at patterns of performances. You know, ADHD in particular, that tends to have a lot of like impulsivity along with it sometimes too.
Yeah.
And so I oftentimes with patients with ADHD, it's like you're in the middle of explaining the instructions and they're just going, you know, and so you have to like stop them. So there's some cues. But then, for example, vascular dementia, attention is an early signal, right?
Okay, yeah.
And so it's being able to tease those apart, and then even testing anxiety. This one's great. So the list learning task, we read it 5 times in a row, and you'll see them tank the first one because they're overwhelmed by the words and they can't handle it. And then the second one, they pop up to like 6 words. So like, and then they do well the rest of the time. So it's like this first trial learning that really freaks them out. But then when you repeat it, they're like, oh, I've got more chances. I can calm down. And so then they do fine. So there are little tricks, but it's all within this context of a clinical interpretation as well. So cool. Okay, so I'm hopefully we'll have some time, but I want to kind of explain what happens next. Oh, there's a clicker. Good. Okay, because I like to walk around.
Do you need the microphone?
Oh yeah, I have to do that. It's me like panic when in the clinic we have people hard of hearing. He's like headphones, a pocket talker on him, and then like I dropped this microphone.
Oh.
Just anything I can say careful. Okay. All right, I'm gonna try to stand maybe over here. So we'll just kind of go through like what this all means. Oh, okay, you're already turning on. It's on. Oh, yeah. Oh, we did. Okay. Oh, great, thank you. Thank you. All right, so to start talking about cognition, maybe we should start by just defining what it is. And so cognition is basically our ability to kind of perceive, process, learn, and kind of remember things, general information to make sense of our kind of environment and surroundings. So it's basically what the brain does. And so cognition can be divided down into several key cognitive domains. And so these include things like attention, we just talked about. So your ability to focus, attention, attend to what you want to shift attention. So you don't want to pay attention to this anymore, but now you need to pay attention to this, and kind of avoid distraction. We have visual spatial, which is our ability to process visual information, kind of make sense of visual information, where it is in space, in relation to one another, things like that. We have fine motor ability and sensory also, but that's kind of like more motor dexterity as far as kind of being able to manipulate material with your hands. We have language. So that's, you know, just somebody's overall vocabulary, how well they can name things, associate words and meanings, and reading and writing also falls kind of within that category. We have learning and memory. So being able to first encode either visual, verbal information, be able to store it in your brain and then retrieve it later on if you need it. And then there's executive functioning, which is really kind of the higher level part of the brain. So they're mostly by our frontal lobes that really kind of integrates these lower level functioning to accomplish higher order tasks and thinking. So things like being able to switch between different rules, working memory, initiate planning, judgment, reasoning, things like that. And so in neuropsychology, we try to tap into each of these domains specifically through, as you just saw, these kind of simple, physical, and behavioral tasks. So these are just kind of, this is a visual facial task, this is a trail making task down here at the bottom that you just saw an example of, that's a fine motor task, naming, and kind of another visual spatial. So there's these basic pencil and paper tasks that we're administering with the idea that each one maps onto a different part of the brain. And so the idea here is that the brain is divided into kind of, well, there's two ways to think about how the brain works. Certainly there's functional connectivity, so these regions are intricately connected to one another. But we also have this concept of localization of function, where there are specific brain regions that underlie specific cognitive thinking and ability. So for example, our temporal lobe is really key for language and memory. We have our occipital lobe that is directly connected to our eyes that processes basic visual information in our environment. That signal then kind of moves up to the parietal lobe that not only takes the basic visual information, but then manipulates it and kind of looks at kind of relations of spatial objects, so visual and spatial sort of processing. We have our sensory and motor cortices at the top here in orange and red. And then we have, of course, our frontal lobe, which is really important for kind of this higher level thinking. It's really well connected to all the other brain areas. And it does things like kind of think, plan ahead, problem solve. What I don't have listed here is there's also a really intricate highway system of white matter pathways that connect all these regions. And so if you think about it, it's kind of like the highway system of the brain. So it underlies things like processing speed. How fast can you get information from one part to the other? And how quickly and efficiently can you process information in the brain? And so as we just saw, we give people these pencil and paper tasks with the idea that we're asking somebody, what is this called? And we want them to tell me it's a cone. So we're testing whether they can link that visual perceptual object with its meaning and its word. And that's what we're interested in. However, it's not so simple. No single test will measure a single cognitive domain. So in order to come up with the correct response on this item, you first have to have an exact attention network. And to be able to focus your attention on the stimulus being presented to you. So that's step one. From there, you have to then correctly visually perceive the object. You have to actually look at that object and be able to, connect that visual stimuli to be able to process it to make out a picture. You then have to get the semantic access. So once the information goes from your eye, your occipital lobe, and you process what it is, you then have to go connect to your temporal lobe, which really links objects with their meaning and kind of names. And that's actually what we're really wanting to get at on this test. And then you have to have an intact language output. So even if you can identify it, you have to be able to say something to get a point on this test. And so importantly, this can break down at any place in that process. And so that's why the whole battery of tests is really important. You have to be able to, based on how they do on all the tests, decide, if is this whole process correct? Is it breaking down here? Is it breaking down here? Why are we seeing errors on this one test? So comparing performances across domains is really critical to determining nature of impairment in the brain. And also cognitive domains are really hierarchical in nature, as we've just kind of demonstrated here. So we have, obviously, these lower level processes will impact performances on a higher level cognitive task. So if you don't have attention, the whole pyramid breaks down, right? But at the same time, not having the higher level processes, they exert control over kind of controlling these lower level processes. So if you don't have, you could have a task and attention, but if you don't have executive function to be able to allocate resources appropriately, you also could be poorly on that test. So it's really interconnected, and that's why looking at all the domains is important, and then comparing them across. The memory process also is not quite as simple as it seems sometimes. I'll tell you in clinic, almost everybody comes to me saying I have trouble with my memory. And then on testing, you realize that process also can break down in different places, and it can indicate pathology in different parts of the brain. So the first stage of memory is encoding, and so that's actually being able to take information from your environment and form a new memory. And that process is entirely and very, very pointedly hippocampal dependent. So our hippocampus is actually what allows us to form a new memory in our brain, whether it's a word list or a story or a picture. The next part of the memory process is storage. So once we form a memory, it's stored kind of in this distributed network throughout the cortex. And this is an oversimplification. But basically, kind of the parts of the brain that light up when you first experience that memory is kind of also like how it's stored. Sequence connections, so like a memory is recreating kind of that initial sort of pattern of brain activity. And so we encode the memory, then we need to store it over time. And then the final step is retrieval. And so that's being able to access that memory at the exact moment that you want it. And so even though the forming of memory is hippocampal dependent, that process of retrieval, so being able to find that memory when you need it, is actually very frontal lobe dependent. And so if you think about it, I have an analogy here. So the encoding process is basically like writing a book. You're making a memory. The storage is basically you're now in the library and you have to find the right place to put that book on the shelf. And then retrieval, if you walk in the library, you have to know exactly which shelf and what row to go get that book. And so without your frontal lobe, good luck, right? You walk in the memory in the library, and you know, how are you going to find that book that you need without your frontal lobe, which basically serves kind of the part system that will basically allow you to say, okay, you need to go here and here to get your memory. So that's like an analogy. It's not exactly how the brain works, but it's a good way of thinking about the different stages of memory and kind of how it all works together. What we didn't demonstrate in our testing today is that there's different types of retrieval that we test for. So first is spontaneous or free recall. So at the end of that 15-minute delay, we'll ask a participant, all right, what were those 15 words on that word list that we read to you earlier? And we try to get them to spontaneously come up with as many of those as they can. At the end though, we then do a recognition trial. So we ask them, was this word on the list, yes or no? Was this word on the list, yes or no? And those two different types of retrieval are, I guess, outcomes of retrieval are really important in kind of figuring out where in the brain this is. So almost every patient, as I mentioned, that comes into memory clinic says, I have a problem with my memory. Some patients will do the word list. They do fine learning. They get to the retrieval and they say, I can't remember any of those words when you first ask them. But then you do the and then you do the multiple choice, and they get every single one of them right. So they clearly encoded it. They clearly stored it. They just couldn't retrieve it without a cue, without you providing additional assistance and kind of looking it up, right? So that indicates maybe it's something more with the retrieval process and maybe a little bit more. Whereas somebody with Alzheimer's disease who has trouble with the hippocampus, they never learned it to begin with. So they never encoded it, they never stored it. When you ask them spontaneously, they also can't come up with the words, but then they can't get the multiple choice right either because they never learned it. So that's why the retrieval or recognition trials can actually be really informative when you're kind of looking at different ideologies and how memory actually breaking down in the brain. So going back to kind of this idea that these tests are really tapping into different parts of the brain and different cognitive functioning, at the end of the day, we're really just left with parameter test performance. That's what we have. And ideally, we're assuming that it is a really good marker of somebody's true cognitive ability. But we know that there are plenty of factors that can impact cognitive performance, some of which we already kind of touched. So one would be psychological factors, test anxiety. Are they depressed? Do they just not even care about being here? Those certainly can impact somebody's score. We have their medical history, and so that's something like a history of somebody who has profound hearing loss, somebody who can't see the stimuli. That can also impact their performance on a test. Are they taking a sedative medication at the appointment? Do they have a sleep disorder that's undiagnosed, or they didn't sleep the night before because they were so worried? Are there any undiagnosed medical conditions occurring that are impacting their cognition? That's really important. We certainly have situational factors. And so these things include things like test setting. So here's an example of what a testing room looks like. And by design, it's meant to be non-distracting. These are meant to be given in a standardized way. We don't want calendars on the wall. We don't want pictures being done. They're supposed to be really sharp. And that's something that we actually can control in the test setting. There's also motivational state. How much, are they fatigued? Are they giving adequate effort? Then there's methodological factors. So did they just take this test last week and they remembered everything from it? What's the administrator experience? Are they administering the test in the way it was standardized and meant to be given? What are the psychometric properties of that test? Is it something that's too easy and everybody always gets everything right and it's never going to come anything? And then finally we have the demographic factors. So these are things like age. So if people get older, they tend to get slower processing speed, for example. That's expected. There are sex differences in how people perform in different types of testing. So females tend to do better with verbal learning and memory. Males tend to do actually a little bit better with visual spatial processing, and that's just kind of proven things. As you mentioned, language can certainly impact it, and education level, for example. And so based on all of these things, how do we know if the performance is truly impaired? And that's always the question. When we're diagnosing dementia, we really care about the impaired. And so the way that we at least we don't overcome it, we try to address this, is that what we do is we norm these tests. So these tests are given to a very large number of people out in the general population that we would consider to be generally healthy, right? And if you have a good test, you're going to get a really nice normal distribution of scores, where most people are going to fall here in the middle percentile, like kind of 50th percentile, and then you have your tails of really high performers and really low performers. And that's just like a baseline. That's just how people would perform on this test in the general population. But we talked about certain things that can systematically impact test performance, like age and sex and education level, for example. And so the demographic factors are something that we actually can easily measure and control for. And so what we do is we take this big distribution of the whole population and we break it down to compare it to what we would consider to be somebody's peer, right? So we match it by age, education, sometimes sex, and sometimes even race. And so once we have our reference group, we redistribute the scores, and then we take that score on the test of the participant and we place it on that distribution. Based on where it falls, that gives us an indicator of compared to their peers, how well is the person actually doing on this test. And so if they're falling in this kind of range, like below 1.5 standard deviations from the mean or below 2, we consider it to be kind of like in this impaired range relative to their peers. We also look at it, and so we would do this process for every single one of the scores that we generate from the testing. And at the end of the day, we end up what we call like a cognitive profile. So this is basically taking all the tests in the ADRC battery, grouping them by the cognitive domains that they assessed, and then kind of comparing them to a normative sample and seeing how they fall in relation to their peers. And as you can see, it gives you these are the raw scores that mean nothing. These are the standardized scores now that we've normed them and compared them to peers, and then we all put them on the same kind of number scale and a percentile, and then there's descriptions that are associated with different cutoffs. And as you can see, this person has a clear pattern of strengths and weaknesses, where their attention seems to be in their visual spatial are actually really doing well, but however, they're showing rapid forgetting across all the memory tests. They're not benefiting at all from recognition trials. They have, on language, they have more trouble with their semantic fluency than say their letter fluency. And then, which I can talk about and just actually, maybe I'll stop there and talk about it because it's actually interesting. So as just a quick little aside, so semantic fluency is like asking somebody, tell me all the animals you can think of in 1 minute. Whereas letter fluency is like, tell me all the words you can in 1 minute to start with the letter F. And you think that maybe they're getting the same thing, but they're actually very much not. So semantic fluency requires an understanding of this idea of exemplar. Like you have to know the meaning of the category and the meaning of things that would fit into that definition of the category. So coming up with animal, you have to know that a peacock, for example, is an animal. Whereas, and that's very temporal lobe dependent, that kind of name, meaning sort of thing, very much in the temporal lobe. Whereas letter fluency, your strategy for that is, tell me where does it start with F? But finger, foot, freedom. And so that's very much motor planning. So you're using the kind of motor planning aspect of like making the sound F, and it doesn't matter what the meaning of the word is. You don't need that. You just need to know how to kind of say words that start with F. And that's actually very frontal lobe. So you can see these kind of nice differentiations between when you see a pattern where there's impairments in semantic fluency, but their letter fluency is still really good. That indicates their processing speed is fine. They're all time tests, right? So they're not doing poorly on all of them because they're slow. They specifically are having trouble with their semantic fluency. In combination with poor naming and with the memory impairment, it really does point to something happening in the temporal. So we look at the pattern of strengths and weaknesses and what areas can be associated with that part of the brain or what diseases. And so in this case, the memory, language, and some emerging executive functioning difficulties really do point to kind of the pathology primarily in the temporal lobe. And that's mostly Alzheimer's disease. Here's another example, and I want to point out something. Both of these examples were given the MoCA, and they had the exact same score on the MoCA, which basically indicates that the MoCA is good at kind of staging overall impairment, but it can't tell you anything more detailed than that. This patient has almost the opposite profile. Their attention is poor, their letter fluency is low, but their semantic abilities are good. They're remembering things okay, but they have some pretty pronounced difficulties with executive functioning. And so that would be something that would then indicate probably kind of frontal subcortical processes, which would make you think something more like vascular dementia. Is time up?
Yeah, about 10 minutes.
Okay, 10 minutes. Okay, good. Okay, so we've gone over this, so I'm just going to fly through it because Sydney talked about this earlier, but there are some cool definitions of dementia that we consider when we're working up a participant. So it requires a change in their function. There has to be a concern for it, either expressed by the patient or their study partner, that something has actually changed and they've just not always been this way. It's a degenerative process. We want change. We also have to show a direct formal impairment on clinical assessment, looking at cognition. These cognitive difficulties must progress to a point where it's now impacting their daily life. Kind of like depression, you can feel depressed, but until it starts to impact your daily life, you don't need criteria for depression. It's the same kind of concept here with the syndrome. These changes must be chronic and persistent. It's not due to a UTI or delirium or psychosis. And then it's presumed to be caused by a brain disease or injury. So we have to exclude all these reversible causes like vitamin deficiency, sleep, mood, alcohol medications. Yes.
Can you talk about like their part or
Study partner?
yes, Right, so I was like thinking like in survey terms, they're proxy. Or
Yeah.
something like that, right? So like, I'm just thinking of if you have a parent and the child comes in and says, my mom is like losing her mind.
Yeah.
And says that there's something wrong with her,
Sure.
but her spouse doesn't.
Yeah.
So like what common, right? I mean, cause like, I feel like it seems like there's something about like the age of the property and the relationship to the participant that like determines whether it's a reliable narrative or not. So like, how do you guys determine that?
Yeah, it's a struggle, especially in WS, we're dealing with your spouses are also in their 80s. There's a couple things just to keep in mind there is that sometimes if you're living in the moment, this is almost why people have trouble seeing changes in themselves. If you're with it every day, the change can be so gradual that you don't fully appreciate the extent of it. The second, so a child, for example, might see their parents left behind, the more stark sort of decline to them. The second is that older adults who maybe with partners like, well, I also have problems with my memory. They're no worse than I am, you know? And so there's this idea of just, you know, not fully appreciating, you know, just normalizing it and to an extent. Or even just being in denial. People are really afraid of getting old and losing their autonomy. So taking away their driver's license, moving them to assisted living, they have an incentive to sort of minimize those times too. So I don't, you know, there's no good way to, I mean, I guess just emphasizing that these are research and nothing's going to happen to them could help. But otherwise, you know, I think that you just have to sort of understand that we struggle with that a lot. We'll have people with growth impaired cognitive profiles and WLS. How are they possibly still managing their medications, but their spouse is like, oh yeah, they do it fine. You know, so you just, you know, you always just kind of have to take that into account and consideration.
And this is one thing that's been really interesting about doing the processes with you guys is like you talking about the fact that like one thing really different working with WLS with the clinic samples where you get in WLS because it's randomly selected population based and they're not coming to the clinic already worried. So like you're seeing more of this in our population.
And we
like they're obviously having problems, but you're seeing a lot of family members not acknowledging.
And we know that also that they're so underdiagnosed in the general population, especially in rural areas, especially where, you know, but yeah, it's systematic.
So in a clinic, you need either the person, the patient to say something's wrong with me, or you need one of their like proxies or their partner or child to say there's something.
Or a physician.
Or
so there has to, so we can get around that pretty easy.
Someone has to bring them to that.
There has to be a concern there's been a change, right? So if you're a PCP and you've been following your patient and last time they did fine following the treatment recommendations, this time they couldn't even remember your conversation last time. So now the clinician is concerned, so they're going to refer them to right? So it has to be this idea of change. PCP who has an existing relationship can detect that most of the time that was family members or spouses, or a lot of times it's really MCI because the patient themselves, they're experiencing the change. So the whole point of the change piece is kind of ruling out just baseline impairments that like may have existed their whole life. That's not dementia. So we need that change, right? Okay, and then as we've talked about a lot, there's a lot of different analogies of dementia. A lot of times people associate dementia with Alzheimer's disease, but there's different things that can cause dementia syndromes, Parkinson's, vascular, Lewy body, frontal temporal, and Alzheimer's. And so, you know, we all know people decline with typical aging, but we're looking for people who are declining at a rate is beyond what we would expect for aging, indicating that there's some type of degenerative process happening in the brain. We diagnose cognitive impairment when that change gets to the point where it's noticeably statistically different than what we would expect for aging. And then once cognitive impairment is diagnosed, you meet criteria for neurocognitive disorder. And whether it's mild cognitive impairment or dementia really depends on has it progressed to that point where then it starts to impact your daily living. So that piece, the functioning piece is very important for diagnostic workup, and it's what we struggle sometimes with survey research for patients who aren't really presenting for reevaluation. And then we talked a lot today about the clinical stage, where we know that this pathology really starts decades before we see these clinical syndrome. We also know that there's kind of a state of uncertainty. So of people we diagnose with MCI, even in a clinic setting, 30 to 50% either remain MCI or revert back to normal. The reverters, maybe we caught them in a bad day, maybe we treated their sleep apnea, who knows? People who say maybe we're just capturing those with the lower end of functioning, right? So it kind of gives this idea. And so there's some autopsy data that kind of speaks to this, right? So these are nuns that were characterized very well cognitively. And upon death, those with no cognitive impairment, over 55% of them have some pathology present in their brain. indicating that like there is this kind of stage, right? On the other hand, of the people diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment where they passed away, 26% had no pathology in their brain that was detectable. So there's this idea of like MCI kind of being the state of clinical uncertainty. We're either catching somebody at the lower end of normal, or we're catching them early in this transition to dementia. So just kind of keep that in mind anytime you see a diagnosis of MCI, like in a research data set, just know that there's a degree of uncertainty about, you know, this one snapshot in time. Okay, so I'm going to skip through these, but I will just kind of point out in general that there are a lot of reversible causes that we want to consider when we're making a diagnosis. Mood is certainly one of them. Depression is very prevalent in older populations and has very notable effects on cognition. In fact, severe depression in older adults is called pseudodementia because they present almost as if they have a progressive dementia. So it impacts memory, attention, and like processing speed. Anxiety, as we kind of touched on earlier, is also highly prevalent in older adults, and it can impact mostly concentration, brain fog, or learning and remembering, and kind of trouble with decision making. I'm not going to go through these, but there's a whole host of medications that can impact cognitive abilities in older adults. The most common that we see in clinic that people don't realize is like, yeah, I take this to sleep every night, and no. Or you know, the anxiety, benzodiazepines is another one we see a lot of. It's really awful for brain function in older adults. And then of course there's sleep apnea. Sleep apnea is really underdiagnosed, I would say, in older adults, but it profoundly impacts specifically kind of learning and memory processes. So I'm not going to go through these, but sleep apnea is associated with a much earlier onset for MCI, and it has some really notable changes in cognition, mostly with initial learning, even though their memory is usually fine. They just have trouble with that learning piece of it. And so we know that there's different types of etiologies. So we've got Alzheimer's disease. The clinical symptoms are trouble forming new memories. That's why older adults with Alzheimer's, they tend to talk a lot about their past. Those memories were already formed, right? So they already encoded them. They have them in their brain. What they can't do is make new memories. And so that's why you have this gradation of like really short-term or recent memory, but then their remote memory is quite intact and they can talk about high school all day long. Okay. And eventually, as the disease progresses, like they no longer can access those memories. But for the most part, they just have trouble forming the new memories because of their hippocampus. Signs of this are forgetting details, trouble recalling names, getting lost, repeating questions, and all of that is due to kind of the early pathology that happens in the kind of medial temporal lobes. We have Lewy body disease that's clinically characterized by kind of these fluctuating arousal and attention. That can be as subtle as just spacing out at times. They have profound and early visual spatial difficulties that leads to things like being in their car on the garage, trying to park it. It's very REM sleep behavior increases the risk of talking, moving around, acting out your dreams in your sleep. It is a huge risk factor. Hallucinations, these are mostly hallucinations of small people and animals. And then anyway, so point is that that's very much visual parietal lobe, early onset of in the parietal lobe of pathology. FTD, we don't see that often in the sample, it's much earlier, but it's a lot of frontal lobe apathy, behavioral changes, disinhibition, inappropriateness. There's also a language variant that's more kind of purely aphasic, so they have trouble kind of speaking and remembering words. That's due to the E43 in the frontal lobes and sometimes in the temporal lobes. CVD, cardiovascular disease, we typically used to define that by divert stroke, so that would be very focal impairments in the brain, but we are appreciating now that, you know, these ideas like microinfarcts where like small white matter ischemic changes accumulate to a degree where it is now breaking down the white matter system. You have things like trouble with attention, slow processing. And then late is kind of a pathology that's emerging. It's really, it's prevalent in much older adults. It tends to be more stable and the slower progressing, but it's really a circumscribed memory deficit. It specifically targets kind of the hippocampus in the brain. And so the idea is that across these different pathologies, depending on where it impacts the brain, you're going to get these really notable differential profiles of cognitive abilities. So for example, Alzheimer's disease tend to have an impact on attention, visual, spatial early on, but really notable impairments in memory and language. Conversely, you've got Lewy body where the language and memory is actually doing quite well because you have these early changes in attention and visual, spatial. So this is just a schematic, but it's really just to demonstrate that these profiles can help us determine what the underlying etiology may be, depending on what part of the brain is most affected. So pulling it all together, what we do in consensus is arrive at a research diagnosis. We do the cognitive testing to get the cognitive profiles, that gives us some clue to what's going on in the brain. We do a careful assessment of somebody's activities of daily living and seeing if those cognitive changes are impacting their functioning. We do a really profound thorough medical history, where we really detail all their medical conditions, their medications. What else could be explaining this? What are their risk factors for things like vascular dementia? Do they have hypertension, diabetes, high cholesterol all together? Is it, so when you take all of this into account, and then of course, biomarkers are always wonderful. We've got blood-based biomarkers and imaging data we can consider at times if it's there. And then from there, we kind of present all of this information in an in-person meeting where between a physician, a neuropsychologist, and often a nurse practitioner, we talk about their social context, we talk about their medical history, all their surgeries, all their medications they're on, how they're functioning in their day-to-day life. I go through the entire testing pattern, talk about their cognitive profile. And as a group, we put it all together to decide first whether they may meet syndromic classification for dementia. So based on all of that, are they actually normal cognition? Are they still doing well? Are they mild cognitive impairment? Or has the cognitive changes led to functional changes in their their dementia? After we decided the syndrome, we didn't have to decide what's the etiology, and that's where we kind of pull it all together as well to determine, does this profile look like it's more consistent with Alzheimer's, vascular, Lewy body, frontal temporal, etc. And so that's how we can provide their diagnoses. It's a complicated thing, we do our best. But as we know, it's a lot of multi-pathology. So we try to indicate what would be primarily driving the syndrome. And with that, I think we're out of time and out of slides. So thanks for your attention. Hopefully this was helpful. I'm happy to answer questions if you have time.
Hey, how many consensus diagnoses you have done? Over 2,000?
In WLS,
Yeah.
yes,
I think
probably almost 3,000.
2,000.
Over 3,000.
over 3,000. How many cases we talked about? Over more than that, right?
I would say over 3,000 cases that have gone through consensus.
Okay.
So we've met 2,000 times.
Yeah. In the WLS study, Sanjay and I are two of those numbers who have personally diagnosed over 3,000 cases so far.
So what happens when the three people disagree?
We talk it out. And
Who wins?
Jewel.
Is it,
I don't know, Sanjay, how good am I convincing?
Or he's very.
is the data? Have you looked
Yeah,
at
we do.
the?
So we've got biomarker data.
No, I mean, like, if you've got three people and you don't come to consensus,
Oh, yeah.
does the physician
Not very
roll the
common.
rest of them? Huh?
Usually, yes.
Yes, okay.
Okay, but I will say.
But it's very rare.
Yeah.
Okay.
And often we do, there's other things we consider like case rates, like somebody in their 90s is probably gonna have Alzheimer's in the brain, So there's also case rates that we have to think about too, their health conditions. So I would say that we generally will do a pretty good job consenting on the diagnosis. We might kind of go back and forth about primary, what secondary, whether something else may be contributing or not. But I think we do have data now that we've got our blood-based biomarkers and we can look at how good they are. And it's pretty good. We're not.
At least for Alzheimer's.
At least for Alzheimer's. I will fully admit some of the other etiologies are a lot tougher in this kind of a research setting. Specifically to the Lewy body, I would say it's really tough because we need to know, I don't know, there's just a lot of more subtle symptoms that can occur in the Lewy body that because we're using an Alzheimer's association sort of thing, I think a lot of the questions are more focused on memory sort of things, but we do a comprehensive nurse evaluation. We do ask about sleep behaviors, we do ask about hallucinations, about motor symptoms. So we try our best.
How many of the three, besides the neuropsychologist, how many actually interact with the individual? All three?
Oh, actually, no, the nurse is the only one that does. So I don't do the testing myself on all these participants. We have trained field interviewers that go to their, at least in WS. In ADRC, Sanjay, I think we have coordinators that do most of that. But in WLS, our nurse practitioners do direct examination with our participants. So they do get a really good sense of kind of their impressions too. So they give us a good kind of context of when they're home, they said that they're doing prior medications, but they couldn't find them, so we get some tips from.
Victoria, you train and oversee.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm sure
She meets with the testers every so often to make sure that things.
we've done extensive training on the also the our nurse practitioners, they're very highly trained in performing that, their part too.
I mean, they're standardized assessments, right? Like this is
Yeah.
part of the
Yes.
reality of trying to take clinic-based measures. Put them in the field. So part of that is training surveying.
And we do a lot of PC, we do a lot of double checking everything, making sure it's all right. Yeah. But every time then.
Yeah.
Time.